The studio lights of the Ed Sullivan Theater were a special kind of harsh. They didn't just illuminate, they dissected. They were the lights of confession, of exposure, of the unforgiving present tense, lights that had blazed down on legends and frauds alike, that had illuminated the faces of kings and comics and everything in between for decades, leaving no shadow deep enough to hide in, no angle flattering enough to lie. Under those lights, the truth had a way of making itself known, whether anyone wanted it to or not. And in the center of that surgical glare, on the worn wooden floorboards marked with the ghostly outlines of 100 past legends, the scuff marks of Carson's Walk, the worn groove of 1,000 guest chairs, David Letterman felt the heat, not from the lights, not from the audience, but from the man sitting 3 feet away. Donald Trump leaned back in the guest chair with a posture of manufactured relaxation that was more intimidating than any leaned-forward aggression. He had the look of a man who had walked in already knowing the outcome. His hands rested on his knees, loose and easy. A thin, knowing smile played on his lips. Not the smile of a man enjoying himself, but the smile of a predator who has already calculated the angles and found them all favorable. The audience, having just applauded his entrance with the uncertain energy of a crowd that wasn't quite sure what it had just welcomed, now sat in a strange and weighted silence. The air was thick. You could feel it pressing against you. This was not the usual pre-interview buzz of anticipation and excitement. This was the quiet before a storm, the particular silence of a room that has sensed something dangerous and gone still. Dave felt it more than anyone, because he knew what had happened 20 minutes before the cameras started rolling. The green room of the Ed Sullivan Theater is a narrow, slightly shabby space, comfortable in the way that places with long histories are comfortable, carrying the energy of everyone who has ever passed through it, the ghosts of 1,000 nervous performers pacing between the catered platters and the cracked leather sofas. On a normal evening, it hums with the low-grade anxious energy of guests checking their hair in the small mirror, producers doing final briefings, assistants carrying revised rundowns. This evening was not a normal evening. Dave's longtime producer, a man who had been in this business long enough to be surprised by almost nothing, had come to find Dave with a face the color of uncooked dough. He had the careful, controlled expression of someone delivering bad news in a building where bad news travels fast. The message had been delivered in the green room by a man who could only be described as a human architectural feature. Broad, still, expensive suit, the particular blankness of face that belongs to men whose job is to make other people reconsider their plans. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. He had outlined the terms with the calm precision of someone reading a legal document, because that's essentially what it was. Mr. Trump would not be asked about his business dealings. His bankruptcies were off the table. His father's company was off the table. Any mention of ongoing legal matters, debt restructuring, or his potential interest in political office was off the table. The interview had been pre-approved. It would cover The Apprentice, his brand, his success, and nothing else. These were not preferences. These were conditions. If the questions strayed from the approved list, the interview was over. Mr. Trump would stand up, thank Dave for having him, and walk off the stage. And he would make certain, in every interview and public appearance that followed, that David Letterman was known as an unprofessional, second-rate host who didn't know how to treat a guest. The producer had relayed all of this standing in the doorway of Dave's office, his voice very quiet, his hands very still. Dave had said nothing for a long moment.
He sat and looked at the bank of monitors showing the live feed from the studio, his stage manager walking the audience through the warm-up, the cameras moving through their blocking, the guest chair already set at precisely the angle that had been negotiated by Trump's team, slightly turned away from the desk, slightly elevated, all of it designed to give the guest the visual impression of authority. Dave looked at the chair. He looked at the monitors. He looked at his producer.
Then, slowly, a grin spread across his face. Not a happy grin, not the warm, gap-toothed grin that audiences loved. This was something older and more deliberate. The grin of a man who has been handed a challenge in his own house and has just decided, quietly and finally, what to do about it. "All right," he said. "Fine. He wants a nice, easy chat." His producer stared at him. "Dave, tell them we're good." He turned back to the monitors and didn't say another word. The first minutes of the interview were exactly what Trump had paid for. Dave opened with the easy questions, the apprentice, the ratings, the boardroom theatrics that had made the show a cultural phenomenon. He was warm. He was generous. He set Trump up and let him knock the softballs out of the park one after another. And Trump did what Trump always did when given an open stage. He expanded. He grew. He filled every inch of available space with the particular energy of a man who has spent his entire life performing confidence, and has done it for so long that the performance and the person have become indistinguishable. "And you get to say the greatest line in television history," Dave said, leaning on his desk. "You're fired." Must be very cathartic. Trump beamed. "Incredibly powerful. You should try it sometime, Dave. Might improve things around here." The audience laughed. Dave chuckled along, a small, tight sound, a laugh that reached no further than the edge of his mouth. Topic by topic, the pre-approved list was checked off. The genius of the concept, the caliber of the contestants, the global reach of the brand, the empire that just kept growing. With every safe and servile question, Trump grew more comfortable, more expansive, more certain that the room was his. He stopped talking to Dave and started talking to the audience, the cameras, the invisible millions watching at home. He was holding court. He had transformed Dave's stage into his stage, Dave's audience into his audience. He was doing what he always did, colonizing every space he entered, replacing its atmosphere with his own. And Dave let him. He sat back. He nodded. He watched. Then he paused. "You know, Donald," he said, his voice shifting almost imperceptibly, just slightly quieter, just slightly more thoughtful, the voice of a man setting something down with great care. "Watching you on the show, you seem like someone who is always in control. You need to be the one with all the information, the one making every decision." Trump took the compliment like oxygen. "Absolutely. That's the only way to operate. If you're not in control, you're a loser. It's that simple." "You can't let anyone have leverage over you," Dave mused.
Never. You can't show weakness. You can't let people think they have something you don't. The moment you do that, you're finished. Dave nodded slowly, picking up the pen from his desk, a small, unconscious-seeming gesture, a prop he had used 1,000 times to give his hands something to do, a shift in pressure, an alteration in the quality of the silence. The audience felt it without understanding it, the way animals feel a change in the weather. They leaned forward, barely perceptibly. "That's what I've always admired about you," Dave said, his voice taking on a tone that was warm and reflective and careful. "That certainty, that ability to just keep moving no matter what, to not let yourself get slowed down by the things that would make a normal person feel exposed." Trump smiled. "You have to. It's the only way." "Sure," Dave said softly, "like with your father."
The silence that fell at the Ed Sullivan Theater at that moment was unlike anything in the room's long history of dramatic silences. It was total, absolute. A single cough from somewhere in the balcony sounded like a gunshot. Trump's expression did not change immediately. It froze. It became a perfect, motionless replica of the expression that had been there a moment before, held in place by what appeared to be sheer muscular will. Only his eyes moved, narrowing, calculating, scanning Dave's face for the angle of the attack. "I mean," Dave continued, his voice gentle, almost sympathetic, leaning forward on his desk in the posture of a man sharing a confidence, "it must have been complicated, growing up under someone like Fred Trump, learning the business from him, working for him, and then trying to build your own identity, your own name. That's a real psychological journey, isn't it? The son stepping out from his father's shadow. I always wondered, was it harder to do that while he was alive, or after, when you couldn't get his approval anymore, no matter what you built?" It was a masterwork of interrogative architecture. It was not an attack. It was a question about family, about motivation, about the interior life of a man who had constructed an elaborate public persona specifically to prevent anyone from asking about his interior life. It was framed as empathy, and it functioned as a scalpel. Trump's grip on the arms of the guest chair tightened. You could see the knuckles. "My father was a great man. He built something real, and I took what he built and made it 10 times bigger, 100 times bigger. That was my work. That was my vision. Everything I have is mine." "Of course," Dave said, soothing, nodding. "The Trump Organization is yours. No one's disputing that. But the psychology of it is interesting, isn't it? You talk about being the boss, about control, about firing people who don't perform. And yet, for the first significant stretch of your career, you were working for the ultimate boss, the man whose name was on the door before you put your name on it." He let it sit there, not pressing, not pursuing, just letting the thought occupy the air.
Trump was adrift. He was being asked to be introspective, to navigate his own interior without the prepared routes, and he had nothing to work with. His armor was built for deflection and attack. It was not built for this. "Speaking of names on doors," Dave said, and his voice shifted again, the gears changing smoothly, inevitably, like a very well-maintained machine. "There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal a few years back, a deep dive into your finances, particularly the Atlantic City operations. Spoke to a lot of your former people, on the record." Trump's color rose. "The Wall Street Journal is a rag. They've been writing hit pieces on successful people for years. It's a total disgrace." "Oh, I know," Dave said, waving the pen gently, the wave of a man dismissing a minor point to get to the important one. "But this particular piece had a quote that stayed with me, from a former president of the Taj Mahal. He said that you told him, and I'm paraphrasing, that the key to the casino business was to borrow as much as possible, build big, and if it collapses, you walk away and let the banks and the contractors absorb the loss, that the personal liability doesn't follow you." The silence was different now. Not the silence of anticipation, the silence of exposure. Trump's mouth opened. For a fraction of a second, the smallest, most revealing fraction of a second, nothing came out. A man whose entire brand was the certainty of his own success was standing at the edge of a very specific accounting, and the numbers weren't adding up in his favor. "That's Chapter 11, he said, his voice finding its footing, hardening. "Chapter 11 is a legal tool. The most successful businessmen in this country use it. It's not failure. It's strategy. It's smart." "It's a strategy," Dave agreed pleasantly, "a legal one. But here's what I keep thinking about, Donald. You've built your whole image on being the winner, the guy who's too smart to lose, too tough to fail, too big to be beaten. And yet the corporate record is, let's be honest, pretty checkered. The casinos went bankrupt. The airline went under. The football team. The mortgage company. You've had to restructure debt with major banks multiple times over. You've been kept afloat by lenders who continued to back you specifically because they couldn't afford to let your name become synonymous with failure. Dave wasn't leaning forward anymore. He had settled back in his chair, calm, unhurried, the posture of a man with nowhere else to be and all night to get there. "So the question I keep coming back to," Dave said, his voice clear and even, the voice of a man asking a genuinely curious question, is whether that's actually the art of the deal. To borrow enormous sums of money, make promises you may not be able to keep, and when it falls apart, walk away intact while the contractors and the suppliers and the small investors who believed in you are left with nothing. Because to the guy who owned the drywall company in New Jersey, I read about him, he did $1 million worth of work on the Taj Mahal, never got paid, had to sell his house, had to let his employees go, lost his business entirely. Dave paused. Was that the deal he was supposed to walk away from? Was he supposed to feel like he'd been outmaneuvered by a smart businessman, or like he'd been left holding a bag that wasn't his?
The audience had stopped breathing. Trump rallied with the force of long practice, the way a boxer gets up from a knockdown not because he's recovered, but because getting up is what he does. "I have thousands of employees. I have built a great company. I am worth billions of dollars. This whole line of questioning is typical of the liberal media bias that—" "I'm not asking what you're worth," Dave said, quietly, firmly, not unkindly. "I'm asking about the people you left behind. And I'm asking specifically because you came on this show tonight to tell people you're a winner, to inspire people, to sell them on the idea that the Trump way is the winning way. And I just want to make sure everyone understands clearly what that way actually entails for the people who aren't Donald Trump in the equation." Trump looked at the side door, the one his security man was standing beside, the one he had reserved as his exit. The audience could feel him calculating the distance, weighing the cost of walking versus the cost of staying. He was trapped in the worst possible way, not by bars, but by the arithmetic of his own situation. Dave let him sit in it. Then he put the pen down. "There's one more thing," he said, "and I want you to know I didn't raise this to embarrass you. I raised it because I think it's part of the same picture." Trump went very still. "In the early 1970s, there was a federal investigation into your father's real estate company. The Justice Department brought a housing discrimination case. The allegation was that the company, which you were already working in as a young executive, had a policy of refusing to rent apartments to black families. The methods described in the case documents included lying about apartment availability, marking rental applications with codes to screen out minority tenants, and systematic intimidation of people who complained. Dave's voice remained level throughout, factual, almost clinical. Your father was sued. You were named alongside him. The case was eventually settled without admission of guilt. That is ancient history, Trump said, his voice low and dangerous, the carefully modulated control giving way around the edges. My father was a great man. He was never convicted. We settled.
You settled, Dave said, the way you settled with the contractors, without admitting guilt, making the problem go away for yourselves, while the people who'd been turned away from apartments because of the color of their skin received a settlement and a piece of paper and no apology. He paused. It's a pattern, isn't it? The settlement as a tool. The same tool you described in the casino business. You make a mess, and you find the mechanism that lets you walk away from it cleanly. He set the pen down on the desk with great deliberateness. And that brings me back to tonight, because before this interview started, a man came to see my producer in the green room, and he delivered a very specific set of instructions about what I was and wasn't allowed to ask you, topics that were off the table, subjects that had been pre-approved, a warning about what would happen if I strayed, that you'd walk off, and that you'd make sure people knew I'd been unprofessional. Dave looked at Trump steadily. You tried to control the room. You tried to intimidate the host, on the host's own stage, because that's the tool you reach for when you're uncomfortable, when you can't afford to let someone else have the upper hand. He looked at the audience for a moment, just a quick glance, a recognition of their presence, and then back at Trump. You wanted a friendly chat tonight, Donald. You wanted to come in here, promote the show, tell everyone how great you are, and leave. And that's fine. That's a legitimate thing to want. But this is my house, and in my house, we don't make deals about what the truth is allowed to be. We ask questions, and we follow them where they go. Because the people watching at home, the drywall contractor, the families who were turned away from your father's buildings, the investors who trusted your name, they deserve a place where those questions get asked. The theater was absolutely still. Trump was looking at Dave with an expression that was difficult to name because it contained several things at once. Fury, certainly, and something under the fury that looked older and less certain of itself. He was a man who had built an entire architecture of self around the premise of his own invulnerability, and something structural had just been removed. Dave let the silence hold for another beat, and his voice softened, dropped to something almost gentle. So here's my last question, and I mean this as genuinely as I know how to mean anything. When you look back at all of it, the bankruptcies, the lawsuits, the contractors, the families in those rental offices, the people who lost things they couldn't get back, do you feel anything? Not for the cameras, not for the answer that plays well. I'm asking if somewhere in there the human accounting of it ever catches up with you, whether you ever think about the people in the wake, whether any of it costs you anything at all. The question dropped into the silence like a stone in still water.
For a long, agonizing moment, 5 seconds, 10, an eternity of live television, Trump simply looked at him. The machinery of response was running, visibly. You could almost see it. The spin, the deflection, the practiced counterattack, all of it cycling through and finding no purchase, no angle that worked, no door that opened onto safe ground. He had 1,000 lines and not one honest answer. He stood up. Not with the energy of defiance, not the powerful, declarative walk-off of a man making a statement. He stood the way a man stands when he has been somewhere long enough and needs to leave. He didn't look at Dave. He didn't look at the audience. He turned and walked toward the side of the stage, his security man falling smoothly into step beside him, and the two of them disappeared into the wing. The theater watched him go in silence. Dave watched him go. He didn't call after him. He didn't reach for a final line. He sat in his chair and watched until Trump was gone. And then he let the quiet stretch for 3 full seconds, longer than silence usually lasts on live television, long enough to mean something. Then he turned to the audience. A slow, tired smile crossed his face, not triumphant, not gleeful, the smile of a man who has done something necessary and is glad it's over. "Well," he said softly, "I guess he had another deal to make." The audience erupted. Not the polite, programmed applause for a guest's departure, something wilder than that and more genuine, the roar of catharsis, the sound of a room full of people releasing something they had been holding since the moment Trump walked through the door. They were applauding for Dave, yes, but they were also applauding for the drywall contractor in New Jersey, for the families who had stood at rental office windows and been told there was nothing available, for every small creditor who had received a settlement and no apology, for the specific, necessary idea that someone's house being their house still meant something.
that there were rooms where the bully's tools didn't work. Dave sat in his chair and let the sound wash over him. He didn't stand for it. He didn't milk it. He just sat there, a slight man under enormous lights, looking a little tired and entirely at peace. After a long moment, as the applause began to settle, he looked directly into the camera. One slow nod, small, certain, the nod of a man who has said what needed saying and means every word of it. The credits began to roll.